Hey everyone, tonight we start with something very strange. The way people thought in the Middle Ages that still affects our lives today. So, before you get too comfortable, please like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. Please leave a comment and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always interesting to see who is joining us from all over the world. Now, turn down the lights and maybe turn on a fan to make a soft background noise. And let's take it easy. The trip we took together tonight, that was a little silly. You might think that the 9 to 5 schedule came from the Industrial Revolution, when smart Victorian men in waistcoats figured out the best number of hours to work before employees started dying. But no, it came from monks. In the Middle Ages, monks were the only people who could tell time and were annoying enough to make everyone else do it. Bells rang all the time in their lives. Bells in the morning, bells at noon, bells for prayer, bells for eating, and bells to remind you that you became a monk. It was more like a divine alarm system with extra guilt than a spiritual journey. They called the hours of the day canonical hours, matins, lords, prime, ter, sex, nun, vespers, and compline. These sound less like prayer times and more like spells that Harry Potter didn't like. Every so often, the monks would stop what they were doing to chant, kneel, or just stare into space. It wasn't about getting things done quickly, it was about following orders. You weren't supposed to use your brain. You were supposed to get in sync with God, the abbey, and the person in charge of the bell tower. And yes, there was always that monk who rang it 2 minutes early just to see the world burn. Then, over the years, the disease spread to the rest of the world. Church bells told towns when to hold their markets. Guilds used them to keep track of the hours they worked, and eventually, factories copied the whole system, except for the praying and the managers who yelled when the Industrial Revolution began. Someone basically said, let's take the monastic routine, take out the faith, and add paperwork. That's how the modern workday started. At least the monks got to be quiet, drink wine, and wear a robe that also served as pajamas. You get fluorescent lights and notifications when you're late. Even the time you take for lunch comes from how monks kept track of time. The sex hour is when monks stop what they're doing to pray and maybe eat a snack before going back to their divine spreadsheets. So, the next time your alarm goes off at 7 a.m. and you pull, you have to work another day to pay rent and deal with mild back pain. Remember, you're not modern. You're like the Middle Ages, but without the singing or the forgiveness. The 9 to 5 didn't change. It got out of the monastery, put on a suit, and learned how to say, let's circle back on that. If you've ever sneezed in public and someone said, bless you, congratulations. You just did something that is one of the oldest and dumbest reflexes in the world. It's not being polite. It's a panic from the Middle Ages that never got the memo about how germs work. When the plague was going around Europe in the 6th century, sneezing wasn't just a little annoying, it was a bad sign. People thought you were sick if you sneezed once. They started splitting up your things if you sneezed twice. It was easy to understand. Your soul tried to get out of your nose when you sneezed. The devil, who was probably hiding nearby, might take the chance to grab it in the air. Pope Gregory the Great came along in 590 CE and decided that God had to step in to help with the sneeze. He told the faithful to say "God bless you" in response, which made breathing a team sport. Every "bless you" was an emergency prayer, like a little exorcism for people with hay fever. The phrase spread faster than the disease itself. Soon, every village in Europe was blessing each other so much that they were all tired. No one could sneeze in peace. Think about the sounds: church bells, roosters, and 40 people from the village yelling, "God bless you," every time someone breathed in pollen. And it worked. Not in a medical way, but in a social way. Saying "bless you" became a way to show that you weren't the kind of person who would let your neighbor die without being blessed. They wouldn't say it was witchcraft. The belief stuck. We still bless people who sneeze like it's 1348, even though we've had science, hygiene, and vaccines for hundreds of years. People don't believe that their souls are leaving anymore, but the sound of nasal explosions still makes us freak out. In the meantime, the only thing that is really getting away: you can sneeze 100,000 droplets of bacteria at 100 miles per hour right into your face, and no one thanks you for that. When you say "bless you" after someone sneezes, you're actually doing a ritual that was made up in the Middle Ages to keep Satan out of someone's sinuses. You're not being nice. You're part of a mass delusion that has been going on for 1,000 years. And somehow, it's still thought to be polite. The next time you twirl spaghetti or stab someone in the back, if you were to eat a piece of chicken in medieval Europe, you would have been called a heretic. Yes, the fork, which is a harmless little tool in your kitchen, was once thought to be a tool of Satan. Around the 11th century, rich Byzantine nobles brought it to Western Europe. They used small golden versions to eat small bites of food without getting their hands dirty. Does that make sense? Nope. The church went crazy right away. According to clergymen, using a fork was disrespectful to God because they said that the Almighty had already given us the best tools for eating: our fingers. It seems that the idea that someone might like metal more than flesh was almost blasphemous. A well-known case was that of a Byzantine princess who married into the Venetian royal family. She brought her gold forks with her, and the priests in the area went crazy. When she died of the plague a short time later, the clergy smugly said that her death was God's punishment for using a shiny pronged stick instead of her own. Digits from God. For hundreds of years, Europeans ate with their hands like cavemen in fancy clothes. Even the rich and powerful in the Renaissance didn't want to use forks because they seemed strange. Knives and spoons were okay. One stabbed and one scooped. Both were biblical. But the fork had a vibe. People also started dying from foodborne illness, which is funny because dirty fingers aren't clean. But no amount of disagreement could change the church's mind. God made hands, so use them. It wasn't. The rest of Europe gave in when Italy's fashionable elite decided forks were stylish in the 17th century, and as usual, the English were the last to join in, calling forks effeminate, until a famous person used one in public. So the next time you sit at a table and politely twirl your pastor, remember this. You're doing something that used to be thought of as morally wrong. The medieval church fought against cleanliness, style, and table manners, and lost. This means that every meal with cutlery is a small victory. For common sense over organized superstition, or what the priests would have called temptation served on a silver platter. Picture bachelor parties with swords if you think they are crazy now. In the Middle Ages, marriage was more about money than love or sharing Netflix accounts. But even then, men couldn't help but make one last bad choice before giving up everything. This is how the first bachelor party, the medieval stag night, came to be. Knights would meet in. They would go to bars or taverns, drink beer until their helmets didn't fit, lose their horses in games of chance, and loudly pledge their loyalty to freedom for about 8 hours. The point of these parties was to honor the groom's new role as a responsible adult. In reality, they were a way to see how much a man could drink before falling into a moat. The stag stood for virility and wildness, which is a medieval word for drunken regret. Guests would raise their glasses to the groom's bravery for going through with it. Marriage while quietly betting on how long he would last in domestic life. Someone would always challenge someone else to a duel, and at least one man would think the bride's cousin was a barmaid. Of course, the church hated these parties. Priests called them feasts of sin, which was true. They said that getting drunk before getting married would send you to hell. The knights saw this as a challenge, of course. Over time, the tradition spread from nobles to townspeople who built taverns instead of castles and armor and leather shoes. But the spirit stayed. Eat, drink, and act badly today because you won't be able to do so tomorrow. The rituals that happened the next day were also familiar. There were hangovers, long, awkward silences, and promises to never talk about what happened. The only real difference between now and then is that medieval men didn't have smartphones to take pictures of the evidence. So, when you see a modern groom with a plastic crown and a look of regret leaving a bar, you're seeing history. It's the same tradition, but without the swords, the plague, and the moral authority of a guy named Sir Geoffrey who tries to juggle flaming torches while yelling for love. Bachelor parties didn't change over time. They just went from chainmail to matching t-shirts. And a monk from the Middle Ages is still praying for all of them. When someone dies today, we automatically wear black. It feels like it honors the dead, is serious, and will last forever. But the truth is that it's just a fashion trend from the Middle Ages that got way out of hand. The color of mourning used to depend on where you lived. It was clean, symbolic, and great for keeping cool while you mourned in the Italian sun. The Romans wore white to funerals, but in the Middle Ages, people said, no, let's make grief sad and fashionable. Black dye was very expensive, so only the rich could afford to look really sad. Peasants couldn't afford to buy sorrow in fabric form, so they wore whatever was clean, which, statistically, it was nothing. The nobles, on the other hand, turned mourning into a big deal. They wore black wool and veils and cried loudly in the streets because, like everything else, grief had to be a performance. The church really liked it. Black stood for being humble before God, and it conveniently made the clergy's clothing choices look pious instead of lazy. Over time, the color of mourning spread to all social classes because wearing something that absorbs both heat and sadness is a sign of repentance. Bye. In the 14th century, black funerals were the most powerful thing you could do. Kings passed away in black. Widows wore black. All of the courts were sad together for years. Queen Victoria brought back the tradition hundreds of years later by wearing black in the mourning for 40 years, which was the longest emotional hostage situation in history. Of course, the color stopped having religious meaning and just stuck around. Now, we all go to funerals dressed like accountants who messed up eternity because the Middle Ages thought grief needed a dress code. The rest of the world, on the other hand, didn't follow. In a lot of Asia, people who are mourning still wear white, which is the color of purity. Bright colors mean a life well lived in Africa. In the West, on the other hand, we like to look like a group of people who are dead and being audited for taxes. So, the next time you wear black to a funeral, remember that you're not showing timeless respect. You're just following a fashion rule from the Middle Ages that rich people made up to look holy. And like all fashion trends, it has never really been about the dead. It's about showing you cared in a more fashionable way than anyone else. The handshake, that holy sign of modern politeness, professionalism, and the occasional exchange of bacteria. It seems nice, polite, and even human. But, like many other medieval traditions, its roots are very shady. During the Middle Ages, people didn't greet each other by shaking hands. They did it to say, "Please don't kill me." People in medieval Europe were very paranoid. Everyone had weapons with them. Everyone owed. Someone else owes money. And every cousin was planning a coup, so when two men met, they would shake hands with their right hands to show they weren't holding a knife. The shaking part came later, a little jiggle like in a play to make sure there was no knife in the sleeve. It was more like a weapons check than a greeting. Knights, merchants, and even kings used it, but they usually did so with a sword hand that shook from the effort of pretending to trust someone. And of course, the small group of people who are left-handed, people thought they were untrustworthy because their sword was on the other side. Medieval logic, as always, is perfect. By the 16th century, it had become a formal way for men to greet each other, replacing bows and the awkward silence that was so popular. It became a symbol of equality, a way of saying we are both free men who could stab each other but choose not to. A few hundred years later, the handshake became a professional thing. Businessmen changed it from a way to stay alive. Strategy into a networking habit. The same gesture that used to make sure neither side was hiding a knife now seals deals worth millions of dollars. Let's be honest, these deals are just the modern version of jewels, but they take longer and involve lawyers. It survived even the pandemic. Doctors told us to stop shaking hands, but everyone said, no, we'd rather risk getting sick than look rude. It's a very medieval way of thinking, so the next time someone shakes your hand too hard at a meeting, keep this in mind. What they really mean is, I'm here to help. The handshake doesn't mean you can trust someone. It's a fossil from a time when trusting someone could get you killed. And since business is still the same, maybe it hasn't changed that much after all. Congratulations if someone has ever told you to stop licking the knife, talk while you eat, or chew with your mouth closed. You're learning how to survive like people did in the past when they were sick of dying at dinner. See, table manners didn't begin because someone wanted to look classy. They began because eating in the Middle Ages was terrible. Imagine a long wooden table with greasy trenches on it, which are basically plates made of old bread that everyone eats off of with the same knife, bowl, and fingers. You didn't have your own tools. You had faith. There weren't any napkins either. It was polite to wipe your hands on the closest dog or neighbor. Monks were unhappy that guests were wiping their greasy hands on the Bible. And yes, there were rules. Against spitting on the table, which means that someone had to make that rule the hard way. By the 13th century, disgust had finally turned into manners. People started passing around manuals. Books like the Book of the Civilized Man told you not to scratch yourself while eating, blow your nose on the tablecloth, or look at your teeth with a knife. These were real instructions, which means they weren't clear at the time. The upper class quickly turned cleanliness into a way to show who was more important. Peasants could eat with their hands, but nobles used manners to show that they were better than others, like a fencing match with spoons instead of swords. In the end, manners turned into morals. The church thought that good table manners showed a clean soul because nothing says holiness like slurping soup while believing in witchcraft. By the Renaissance, eating had gone from a way to stay alive to a way to show off. Banquets were less about eating and more about showing that you weren't a savage. It was like Instagram, but with trenches. And yet, we still follow those same rules from the Middle Ages. No burping, don't choose, don't yell. You're not doing them to be polite. You do them because if you didn't, you might have gotten dysentery in another timeline. You might think that the weekend is a modern idea, a victory for labor unions, productivity science, or smart bosses who valued rest. Nope. It was made up by peasants in the Middle Ages who wanted to stop working long enough to drink, pray, and sometimes remember what sunlight was like. How it looked, people in the Middle Ages didn't know what a weekend was. You worked until your body gave out. Then you did a little more work. But the church, in its infinite mercy, decided that people should take a break every now and then, not for their health, but to go to Mass and not sin on their own. There were a lot of feast days on the church calendar, sometimes as many as 100 a year. These were religious holidays that honored little-known saints, the Virgin Mary, and sometimes events that sounded a lot like excuses to party. On each feast day, people got the day off work, free food, and the right to drink before noon. The nobles were unhappy that the peasants had too many days off. One famous medieval bishop complained that the people worked one day and rested 3. This may be the first time a manager has ever complained about how hard their employees work. Over the years, the Reformation cut out a lot of the fun stuff, like saint days that were too fun. The Puritans were especially horrified that people liked to relax, so they pushed for a stricter system that included a mandatory day of rest, Sunday. This is how the Lord's Day slowly became your modern lazy day. Then the Industrial Revolution happened. Factory owners saw that workers who were overworked and unhappy kept breaking things, even themselves. So they brought back rest days, but not without a fight. Someone later realized that workers who weren't tired made fewer mistakes, like falling into machinery, so Saturday afternoons were added. By the 20th, in the 20th century, the 2-day weekend became official, one day for God and one day for feeling bad. So the next time you fall into bed on a Saturday night, remember that you're taking part in a tradition that started with medieval religion, was improved by Protestant guilt, and was perfected by capitalism's need to make you love Monday again. People didn't get the weekend because they were nice. It was a holy compromise between sin, survival, and making plans. And for some reason, we're still thanking God for it. When you put on a wedding ring, you are not just saying you love someone forever today. You're acting out a property exchange from the Middle Ages. Marriage wasn't romantic in the Middle Ages. It was a business deal with pretty vows. The paperwork came first, then love, usually followed by regret and managing land together. The ring didn't mean that you were devoted. It was a receipt. The ring's history goes back to ancient Egypt, where round bands stood for eternity. The idea spread through Rome, where men gave rings to women as proof that they owned something. When it got to medieval Europe, the church saw that it was great PR and a sign of faithfulness that also worked as a legal shackle. People thought that a vein of love, the vena amoris, ran straight to the heart, so the ring was put on the fourth finger of the left hand. This was totally crazy. People in the Middle Ages also thought that demons caused headaches and that leeches were doctors. But the myth stuck, mostly because it sounded poetic enough to make the cost of gold seem worth it. Weddings. They weren't very religious until the church got involved. Before that, it was the law of the land. You said, "I do," in front of witnesses, shook hands, and then you were legally married. The church thought it could make money. Soon, only unions that were blessed by the clergy were real, and rings became necessary props. And don't be fooled, men didn't often wear those early rings. For hundreds of years, the ring was a one-way sign that a woman owned something, not that she was in a relationship with someone. Husbands didn't wear them until the 20th century, when soldiers in World War II started wearing rings to remember their wives or let everyone know they were taken, even when they were away. Now, the wedding ring is everywhere. It's a small metal circle that is supposed to stand for love, trust, and forever, until someone leaves it on the sink in the bathroom. So when you look at that gold band, think about what it really means. Not a love that lasts forever, not a blessing from God. It's a medieval merger agreement that has lasted through every cultural collapse since the Crusades. You don't have on a sign of love. You have a 900-year-old contract with better branding on it. A home in the Middle Ages would have made a modern studio apartment look like Versailles. Walls are not necessary, doors are overrated, and privacy is a myth. Most people lived in one-room houses with their families, pets, and any spirits that were haunting the rafters. Please stop stepping on the chicken was the medieval idea of personal space. But then came fabric, that amazing technology that could hide things without putting up new walls. Curtains were first used for practical purposes, like heavy drapes to keep out drafts, flies, and nosy neighbors. But they quickly turned into social statements. Nobles started putting thick, embroidered curtains around their beds, not just to keep warm, but also to look dignified. These bed hangings were like portable bedrooms that made it seem like you had your own space in a hall full of servants, snoring relatives, and the occasional bard. If you had a lot of money, your bed had curtains so nice that they could be used as stage sets. A few even had inner curtains to keep your spouse from seeing you. It seems that guests shared a room and sometimes even a bed, so if you needed to change clothes, pray, or cry loudly, curtains were your only protection. Eventually, peasants figured it out and used whatever rags they could find to divide their homes. Putting a blanket between you and the pigsty suddenly felt like a luxury. In the Middle Ages, curtains were like noise-canceling headphones, mostly symbolic, with some success. The idea spread over time. Privacy became a goal for society. By the time of the Renaissance, curtains were on beds, walls, windows, and even egos. The more money you had, the thicker your curtains were, and we still do it hundreds of years later. We close our curtains at night as if we're trying to hide from the Inquisition, not the porch light of the neighbors. We get thermal curtains, blackout curtains, and privacy shears. We have proof that we improve the fabric, but not the paranoia. Remember that when you close your curtains before bed, you're doing something that people did in the Middle Ages. Keep yourself safe from gossip, judgment, and cold air. The only real difference is that your neighbors probably aren't watching. When you hear God Save the King, you probably think of national pride and a dignified song sung by loyal citizens. But back in the Middle Ages, it had nothing to do with being a patriot. It was a casting out of evil spirits. The phrase started out as a prayer for protection, like a spiritual life insurance policy for kings who were as likely to die at a jousting tournament as a ham sandwich. People in the Middle Ages really thought that God chose kings, but they also thought that Satan had a lot of trouble with boundaries. People blamed demons for every plague, rebellion, or bad harvest. So, God Saved the King wasn't a cheer. It was managing a crisis. The church organized public prayers to keep evil away whenever a ruler got sick or someone sneezed near the throne. People would chant, "God save the king," like it was a magic spell because they thought it was. The reasoning was something like this. If enough peasants yelled the phrase loudly enough, God might hear it over the screams of the dying. It worked just like you thought it would. Medieval kings still died, mostly from poison, war, or other kings. But people kept chanting because superstition is the only political tradition that people never change. By the 1500s, the phrase had become a part of ceremonies. It was seen in church services, royal processions, and when people were trying to look loyal. Saying it out loud showed that you weren't planning anything. Betrayal. Not today, at least. When talking bad about the crown could get you killed, God Save the King was less about faith and more about staying alive. The song version came much later, in the 18th century, when England made this medieval emergency chant into a national anthem. At first, it was as, "Please don't let the devil kill our king." Then it became, "Please don't let France do it instead." And here we are, centuries later, still singing it with our hands on our hearts, pretending it's about unity when it really was just holy water from a lot of people. When you hear a stadium full of people singing "God Save the King," remember that you are watching a ghost ritual from the Middle Ages. Now it's on TV. A day of rest sounds nice, maybe even progressive, but the medieval church didn't come up with it to help you balance your work and personal life. They made it so you wouldn't miss Mass. The church ran everything in Europe during the early Middle Ages. Your calendar, your conscience, and if you need to, your life after death. So they made Sunday a holy day of rest. Not because the peasants needed a break, but because the priests needed people to listen to them. If you worked on a Sunday, you weren't breaking the law, you were sinning against God. This was not a small mistake in HR. It was eternal punishment. Think about how you would explain that in confession. "Forgive me, Father, for I worked in the garden during Vespers." It was clear what the rule was. There was no plowing, weaving, blacksmithing, or selling things. Of course, unless the church wanted to sell forgiveness, that was okay. Miraculously good, sermons warned that people who didn't honor the Lord's Day would be punished by God, and there were a lot of them because people in medieval Europe loved horror stories. One story was about a man who tried to make bread on a Sunday. The dough became snakes. Another farmer sharpened his scythe and then died right away. The moral God had things to say about what you did on the weekend. Of course, the rules weren't always followed. Lords and nobles still worked when they wanted to because of God. Management didn't have to follow the law, just like modern policy. The peasants were threatened with hell for trying to stay alive, though. People rediscovered the Sunday rule and called it family time again when the industrial age came. Employers said it was moral. The workers said it was barely enough. The logic, though, stayed medieval even after 1,000 years of progress. You don't rest because you deserve to. You rest because someone who is holier, richer, or louder told you to. Most of us spend Sundays resting by doing things like unpaid work, laundry, and worrying about Monday. It's not exactly holy, but it's a tradition. So don't feel bad about checking your email on a Sunday again. You are not going against God. You're just following the medieval tradition of working when you shouldn't. If your boss emails you about it, tell them your dough just turned into snakes. When someone calls you sir or ma'am, it seems like they are being polite and respectful, but back then, those words didn't mean I. I respect you. They meant that I knew you could legally kill me. Titles of address were like armor for the language in feudal Europe. Society was like a human pyramid, with kings at the top, peasants at the bottom, and everyone else in the middle. You called someone sir, which is short for sire in Old French, to show that they owned your land, your business, and maybe even your spine. It wasn't a choice either. If you met a noble and forgot to bow or didn't use their title, it wasn't a social mistake. It was against the law. In the 14th century, etiquette books said that a man of low status had to speak to his betters with respect or risk being punished. Of course, correction in the Middle Ages meant public humiliation and light beating. Women had their own version. Madame, which means my lady, is short for madame. That wasn't love. It was language of ownership. It told everyone that this woman was in a higher social class than you, usually because she was a real man above yours. The title got less harsh over time. The nobles lost their F foams and sir and mom as they moved down the social ladder, and these words became meaningless. We use them for cashiers, customers, and people who stand in the way of the grocery store aisle. Small verbal nods to a social order that isn't really there anymore, but still feels like it is. People in America use them to be polite. The British use them to sound better than others. And in the South, sir and mom can mean anything from real respect to a verbal slap, depending on how you say it. It's a sign of language evolution in action. Feudal submission packaged as customer service. So, the next time someone calls you sir or mom, think about how they used to talk to a lord in the Middle Ages. You didn't earn your power. You got your vocabulary from someone else. And when you say it to someone else, you're not being nice. You're just acting out feudalism with better manners and worse tips. If you've ever had to wait in line for a permit or sign a form that needed, you owe that experience to the Middle Ages if you had to get 3 other people to sign something or sent an email to someone just to check in. Bureaucracy, which is the best way for people to look organized while doing nothing, was invented in the Middle Ages. Kings couldn't run kingdoms by themselves back then. They needed people who could read and write to keep track of who owed taxes, who owned land, and who had been put to death recently. So the first clerks came into being. Men in robes with quills, ink, and a strange power to make small problems last forever. The church made it perfect. Every miracle, sin, confession, and tithe had to be written down, stamped, and filed 3 times. The first offices were medieval monasteries. Candlelit cubicles were full of unpaid interns who were called novices. Their writing was beautiful, but their spirits were not. By the 12th century, royal governments were also involved. Kings of England used armies of scribes to write down every cow, fence, and person in the country. The result was the first day book in history, the Domes database. It was supposed to organize the kingdom, even though it was a little harder to search. It mostly made things more confusing. Soon, every European government copied the idea. There had to be a form for everything that existed. Property disagreements led to scrolls that were longer than marriages. You had to sign, seal, and witness births, deaths, and taxes. It was almost treason to lose your papers. The real genius of medieval bureaucracy was how it could make work for itself. You needed a record for every law, for each record, a clerk. 4. Every clerk had another clerk check the handwriting of the first. It was a perfect ecosystem that could take care of itself, a paper based perpetual motion machine that runs on frustration. Nothing has changed in the modern world. We've traded parchment for PDFs, quills for keyboards, and seals for email signatures, but the spirit is still there. You still need permission to do things that no one really understands. So, the next time you're on hold or filling out a form that asks for the same information, take comfort in knowing that you're part of a tradition that has been going on for 1,000 years. Kings in the Middle Ages had scrolls. You have sheets of paper. Both are equally useless, but at least yours has a button to send it. If you think Twitter started the culture of outrage, you clearly haven't met a villager from the Middle Ages who had free time and a church bell. Moral panic was the only thing that kept the Middle Ages going. There were no news cycles or trending tabs, just rumors about priests and the odd goat that seemed to be acting strangely. Someone saw a comet, someone else said it was the widow's fault, and then half of the town was on fire. Society didn't need proof back then. It needed someone to blame. Drought, witches, sickness, witches, bread that didn't rise, and definitely witches. It was a simple answer for everything that went wrong. If there weren't any witches around, heretics or foreigners would do just fine. The church made this happen by being very efficient in business. Fear brought in more people. If you could get people to believe that sin caused, people would give more money if they thought that plagues and heresy caused earthquakes. It's like medieval crowdfunding for God's protection. Inquisitors went from town to town getting rid of corruption, which mostly meant asking leading questions until someone admitted to dancing with the devil. People were also entertained by public hysteria. People in the community came together for witch trials. People brought food. The same people who cheered at executions would pray for mercy the next morning. A perfect mix of guilt and show. Let's be honest, not much has changed. We took down the gallows and put up comment sections and Wi-Fi instead. Someone messes up and everyone jumps on them. By sunset, there's digital yelling, moral superiority, and no real answers. The same beat, but the spelling is better. Fear kept order during the Middle Ages. Algorithms keep people interested in modern panic. Both make you feel good about yourself, but don't do anything. It's a tradition that has lasted through plagues, printing, and more, the Enlightenment and presses. And it still lives on every time someone says, "I can't believe you'd post that." Renaissance Rome was meant to be the center of holiness, a city where saints prayed, pilgrims cried, and every corner was filled with divine light. But if you took off the gold-plated marble and fresco, you'd see something completely different. A place where faith and desire were equally strong. The same bells that rang for church also rang for a city that was drunk on its own bad habits. By the early 1500s, the Holy City was a strange place. People came as pilgrims looking for salvation, but the streets smell like wine and perfume. There were a lot of priests in the bars around Pozza Navona who had clearly broken their vows of chastity and maybe even sobriety. Noblemen walked around in velvet doublets, and courtesans leaned out of their balconies and laughed as the church bells rang. Even confession, which was supposed to cleanse the soul, turned into an erotic ritual whispered behind lattice screens. There was temptation all around you, sponsored by the same organizations that are supposed to stop it. Monks were interested in alchemy and spent more time making love potions than copying the Bible. Nuns wrote love letters to each other and hid them in the pages of Psalms. Bishops threw parties with roasted peacock, dancing girls, and wine that never seemed to stop flowing. These parties would have made the pagan emperors blush, and at the center of it all was the Vatican, which claimed to be the fortress of morality. During the day, the papal palace was covered in virtue, but at night, the hallways were lit by candles and filled with laughter. Servants said they saw their mistresses sneak through hidden doors, and there were rumors that cardinals had more children than they could count. Rome, the city of saints, had become a Renaissance version of Las Vegas. If Las Vegas charged people for indulgences and quoted the Bible while doing it, no one seemed to be really upset. It was an art form to be hypocritical. In the morning, a priest might preach about lust and then go see his mistress in the afternoon, and by evening, they had commissioned a painting of the Virgin Mary that looked suspiciously like her. People wore holiness like jewelry back then, and it shone in the light and faded in the dark. Rome said it was the city that would last forever. But at the height of the Renaissance, the Vatican was more like a royal court than a monastery. There was drama, ego, and scandal there that would make a soap opera. The Pope wasn't just God's voice on earth. He was often the richest and most powerful man in Italy, and at other times he was the most dishonest. The so-called papal playboys' reigns made this very clear. Men who had no trouble mixing personal pleasure with sacred duty like water and wine. Take Pope Alexander V VI, who was born Rodrigo Burra and whose name became known for sin wrapped in silk. He had at least 8 children, according to official records. Well, Rome lost track unofficially. His mistress, the beautiful Vanza de Catane, lived openly in a palazzo near the Vatican. His other lover, Giulia Ferrese, was known as the Pope's concubine by half of Europe. While he preached virtue, his son Cesare Bouillet left a trail of blood across Italy, and people said that his daughter Lucrezia poisoned her lovers at banquets. The Borgias didn't try to hide their bad habits. They showed them off by wearing velvet robes with the family crest on them. But Alexander wasn't the only one who was open-minded about religion. Pope Julius II, also known as the Warrior Pope, spent more time in armor than investments and led armies instead of prayers. People knew he swore like a king, pay for art and hire soldiers. A pope who had at least one illegitimate daughter paid for Michelangelo's fresco in the Sistine Chapel, which is ironic. At the same time, Pope Leo I, the 10th pope from the Medici family, treated the papacy like a Florentine bank account, throwing parties so lavish that even Roman nobles were embarrassed. For these guys, indulgences weren't just something that the church taught, they were a way of life. Their banquets were full of cardinals, courtesans, poets, and painters, all of whom were swimming in gold and gossip. It wasn't crusades that emptied the Vatican's treasury, it was carnival masks and mistresses. But the faithful kept giving money because they thought the Pope was the world's moral center. The streets of Rome knew better. The people didn't ask for his holiness when a new pope was chosen. They placed bets on his lovers. The church had turned into a theater of sin with silk and incense. There was a heartbeat behind every holy order, one that was lusty, ambitious, and totally human. The popes were the kings of sin, and the courtesans of Rome were its queens. They weren't the kind of people you see in back alleys. They were the glittering elite, the so-called courtesan honesta, or honest courtesans. Of course, he's honest, just like a wolf is honest about wanting sheep. These women could quote the Bible in one breath and recite Oid in the next. They wore gowns that could bankrupt a cardinal and jewelry that probably already had. Imperior Cogniati, better known as La Divina Imperia, was one of the most famous. Noblemen were scared and awed by her name alone. She had cardinals over for dinner, artists and diplomats in salons filled with incense and gossip. She was more than just a pretty face. She was smart enough to break down a bishop's argument about virtue while drinking Venetian wine. People in the city mourned her death as if she were a queen. Even the priests sent flowers, acting like it was out of Christian love instead of fond memory. Then there was Tullia d'Aragona, a poet and philosopher who was said to have been in love with half of the Vatican's secretaries. Tullia wrote essays in defense of women's right to pleasure, which made priests choke on their communion wafers. Artists and thinkers would come to her house to talk, and somehow, every time they talked about religion, they ended up talking about lust. Like seasoned diplomats, these women knew how to play the dangerous game of Roman society. Courtesans became the smartest players in a city run by men who preached purity but lived in excess. They knew all the secrets, all the affairs, and all the promises made in candlelit confessionals. A well-placed word from a courtesan could end someone's career or start a fight between popes. And not only were they allowed, they were needed. When diplomacy didn't work, Rome sent not soldiers, but smiles. Noble women were watched, but courtesans could go wherever they wanted, acting as unofficial ambassadors with their charms. They were the real intelligence network of the Renaissance, hidden behind their jeweled corsets and painted lips. It's funny that these sinners often acted more smartly and with more dignity than their supposed moral higher-ups. They turned the system that oppressed them into an art form. Priests chased them in secret, and poets wrote about them in verse. The courtesans of Rome showed that power didn't always wear a mitre. It sometimes wore a silk veil. Priests and popes made headlines with their scandals, but noble women in Renaissance Rome created their own, less public, but just as daring. These women lived in marble palaces that were covered in virtue, but their hearts and letters were full of Desire. In their world, marriage was a political agreement, not a romantic one. So when a duchess was stuck with a boring husband who was twice her age, the best thing to do was to get a confessor, someone who would listen carefully and sometimes stay the night. Victoria Colonna, a famous poet and widow of a nobleman who died in battle, was one of the whispered legends. She was a favorite in religious circles in Rome because of her piety. But people were surprised by her friendship with Michelangelo. Really lowered, their letters were full of spiritual longing and poetic tenderness, and they walked a fine line between divine love and forbidden desire. The church said it was platonic. Rome said it was clear. Some people were much less subtle. The Orini and Ferese women, whose names were as important as the popes, used their looks and power to get cardinals, artists, and ambassadors to fall in love with them. Their salons turned into places where people flirted, and poetry, music, and philosophy were just excuses for it. Seduction. People had affairs by writing secret letters, hiding tiny love notes in saintly portraits, and going on pilgrimages that just had happened to lead to a lover's villa outside the city walls. But being careful was how to stay alive. If a nobleman's bad behavior could be excused as a strong temper, a woman's could lead to exile or worse. That didn't stop them. Many noble women learned how to look holy while doing bad things. They went to confession every day to make sure their sins never added up too high, and dressed modestly in public while hiding embroidered bodices under their cloaks. There was a story of guilt and hunger behind every painted virgin on a palace wall. While the Vatican yelled about purity, noble women in Rome wrote sonnets about love. They were familiar with the game. Sin quietly, feel bad about it, and never get caught. In a city where men had power in public, women learned to have power in private, and their whispers in the dark were often louder than any sermon from the pulpit. Art was the most respectable way for Romans to hide their desires. Under the halo of divine inspiration, painters and sculptors filled chapels with visions that were more about flesh than heaven. The Renaissance brought back the human body, and artists loved it so much that they sometimes forgot where beauty ended and blasphemy began. Rome's golden boy, Raphael, is a good example. His frescoes were full of peace, but behind the calmness was a man who was well known for not being able to resist temptation. His Lafarina, the muse, was the daughter of a baker and had curves that inspired half of Madonna's. He became obsessed with her, made her his secret partner, and some people even said she was the real model for the Virgin Mary. When Raphael died young, people said it wasn't because of a fever, but because he was too tired from studying art too hard the night before. Michelangelo, on the other hand, fought with guilt as much as he did with marble. His figures on the ceiling of the Siene Chapel were technically biblical, but everyone could see how much he loved them, made every muscle and curve look perfect. Some church leaders complained that his saints looked too much like people. People who supported Michelangelo called it divine anatomy. People who didn't like it called it porn. The man prayed, sculpted, and suffered, torn between his devotion and the undeniable beauty of the body. Then the real rebels showed up, with Caravaggio being the most important. His art was full of divine light, but it also had a lot of human flaws. He often used prostitutes and thieves as models, and he painted their raw sexuality on the faces of saints and martyrs. He thought that holiness and sin were two sides of the same coin. People couldn't decide whether to cross themselves or look away when they saw Judith beheading Holofernes because the painting was so violent and sexually charged. There was an evil inspiration for every holy task. The church paid artists to make God look good, but by doing this, they also praised the human body, which the church warned against. Instead of rosaries, their studios had paint and skin as confessionals. Art wasn't just for decoration in Renaissance Rome, it was a visible temptation. Every brushstroke was a risk between being saved and being in trouble. As frescoes spread across the walls of the city, so did the rumor that the naked human body was God's greatest work of art, not the soul. If you wanted to see the real heart of Renaissance Rome, not the marble statues or papal decrees, but the heart that was full of sin and laughter, you went during Carnival. Rome forgot its morals for a few days every year, remembered what it wanted. Masks hid faces, wine took the place of sermons, and the line between priest and peasant disappeared in the light of the torches. Even the church let go a little during Carnival. Cardinals went to masquerades to watch the young people, which usually meant chasing dancers until dawn. Monks walked around drunk on spiced wine, quoting the Bible like men who hadn't read it in a while. People said that even the Pope, who was safe inside the Vatican, would look out from balconies and laugh at his cities yearly, going down into chaos. The streets were full of sin and meaning. Floats showed virtue winning over vice, but most people who watched were rooting for vice. Courtesans dressed up as nuns, nuns dressed up as courtesans, and it looked like both groups enjoyed the mix-up. The next week, confessionals were full. Priests shook their heads sadly as they wrote down who had done what with whom and what they had said in those confessions. They became the unofficial gossip network in Rome. A penitent might admit to having an affair with a married cardinal, only to have a smirking servant tell her about her sins later. In the eternal city, secrets didn't last long. One monk even made a joke that the Holy Spirit didn't come down as a dove in Rome. It came as a rumor. The contradiction was amazing. People punished and celebrated sin at the same time. Carnival parades went under a painting of the Last Judgment. The same hands that threw roses into the crowd the night before held rosaries the next morning. The faithful blamed people for their weaknesses, as if weakness were the city's favorite sport. Rome washed its face and put its halo back on after the party was over. The priests yelled about virtue. The nobles went back to their marriages, and the streets smelled like incense again instead of sweat and wine. But the memory stayed. There was a hangover behind every holy procession, and beneath every aviario whispering in penance was a quiet smile that said, "I know." Everyone in Rome knew one thing. It didn't cost much to forgive, but the pleasures of sin were worth more than anything. The Borgias must be included in any discussion of the moral decline of Renaissance Rome, the family that made sin a part of government. If regular Romans talked about greed and lust, the Borgias made it official. Rodrigo Bouye, who became Pope Alexander V 6th, ruled like the godfather of an Italian crime syndicate. If the crime syndicate also gave out indulgences, his Vatican was a place of sin. Witnesses talked about banquets, where courtesans ate naked and rooms were covered in silk and smelled like scandal. One night that became known as the Banquet of Chestnuts was especially bad. There were 50 dancers, cardinals throwing roasted chestnuts on the floor, and guests crawling to pick them up in a show of shameless indulgence. It didn't matter if the story was made up or not. Rome believed it, and that was all that mattered. Rodrigo's kids were the best proof of his two legacies. Cesare Borgia, the Pope's favorite son, was very charming, good-looking, and completely heartless. He killed his enemies just as quickly as his father used to grant pardons. Lucia, Cesare's sister, became a legend in her own right. She was accused of incest, poisonings, and seductions, but most of it was probably lies spread by her enemies. But the fact that she could control the men around her, including her husbands, lovers, and even popes, made her one of the most dangerous women in Europe. The Borgias made it hard to tell the difference between being holy and being hedonistic. Their private sins affected public policy. Cardinals were. There were bribes to get jobs, gold was given to forgive sins, and marriage contracts were signed with sheets instead of signatures. Rome had seen dishonest popes before, but never one who acted like the papacy was a family business. But the Bowers were just more honest about what everyone else was doing behind closed doors. Other families hid their extra money behind Latin sermons, but the Borgias wore theirs with pride, gilded and scented. They turned the Vatican into a battlefield and a brothel at the same time. The day. Rome breathed a sigh of relief when Alexander V 6th finally died, but they also admired him. He had done wrong, but he was unforgettable. His time in power left the church dirty, his name cursed, and his legend lives on. The Borgias showed a truth that has stood the test of time in Renaissance Rome. Sin could be the most powerful thing in the right hands. The church in Renaissance Rome was not just a victim of sin, even though it was angry and preached against it. It was what made it possible. The hierarchy thundered against lust. From the pulpit, but inside those marble walls, the sound of coins clinking was louder than conscience. Every sin forgiven and every sin paid for was part of a big economy of forgiveness. As long as your donation was big enough, you could sleep with your mistress, tell her about it the next morning, and walk out with a clean conscience. This wasn't being hypocritical, it was work. After all, sin was a steady source of income. People who wanted to make up for the pleasures they fully intended to enjoy sent money to the Vatican. Do it again. In a way, the church had turned desire into a service you paid for. Do something wrong, confess, pay, and do it again. Even making indulgence certificates became a big business. Instead of reading the Bible, monks were counting receipts. Cardinals owned vineyards, lent money, and kept up with their fancy estates, which were full of servants and lovers. People in the area called one bishop's palace the house of the Lord and his extended family because he had so many illegitimate children. And still, these same men led inquisitions and moral trials, punishing peasants for sins that were almost part of Vatican tradition. When voices of change started to be heard, like monks saying the church had lost its soul, they were silenced or sent away. It was risky to say that God's messengers were acting like merchants. Even so, rumors about papal indulgence and debauchery spread faster than any order. Even the faithful started to laugh when priests told them not to give in to temptation. They had heard too many sermons. And at the local bar, the irony was heavenly. The church needed sin more and more as it preached against it. Without lust, greed, and guilt, half of Rome's economy and the other half of the Vatican would go down in a flash. Some people tried to change the system from the inside. A few honest friars spoke out against the corruption, but they were ignored, given new jobs, or mysteriously got sick. Others just accepted that Rome's holiness was only a theory at best. A tired priest wrote in his diary, "We do, not in the city of God, but in the city God pretends not to see." And so the church kept up its divine performance under 1,000 candles and painted saints, half prayer, half giving in, all human. Rome had mastered the art of pretending to be holy by the end of the Renaissance. There was a shrine on every street corner, a confessor for every family, and a well-thought-out excuse for every sinner. Virtue was no longer a part of the soul, it was a dress. The city wore it with pride, sewn with silk, pearls, and just enough incense to cover up the smell of lies. Men walked into church with prayer books in one hand and love letters in the other. At Mass, women crossed themselves while secretly looking at their lovers 2 pews away. Artists painted angels with the faces of the people who inspired them. Popes ordered altarpieces to make up for the big parties they had the night before. Everyone in Rome was an actor, and the theater was great. The smart people knew how to play the game. You didn't have to be good, you just had to seem good. A tear at confession, a big gift to the poor, and a holy look when someone talked about sin. Reputation was the city's money, and then everyone protected theirs better than their own soul. You were human if you sinned in secret. If you got caught, you were in trouble. Morality itself became popular. People traded religious relics like they traded jewelry. Pilgrimages turned into social events. And charity was the Renaissance's way of doing public relations. Noblemen didn't build new churches for salvation. It was for status. A fresco of the Last Judgment could clean up your legacy faster than 1,000 prayers. The Vatican called it faith. Rome called it a plan. And yet, in the midst of all this dishonesty, there was something almost poetic. The city was corrupt, but it was also alive. Passion and hypocrisy danced together in perfect harmony, creating art, architecture, and ideas that still fascinate people today. A work of art was born in the light for every sin that was whispered in the dark. In the end, Renaissance Rome wasn't just bad, it was human. It showed the world that even the most holy men and women could want and dream, and that beauty could grow from the dirt of corruption. The Eternal City survived its scandals because it never really wanted to be perfect. It wanted to live forever, and in that quest, even sin became holy. You didn't come into fame, you were born into dirt and horse sweat. The sound of hooves in the stables rocked you to sleep. Charioteers in ancient Rome were not from noble families, bloodlines. They were from chains. Most of them were slaves, prisoners of war, or poor freedmen with more scars than coins. But that didn't matter, because in the circus, Maximus, even a slave, could become a god if he made it to the end of the race. You learned how to run with the horses as soon as you could walk. They were your only teachers, and they were mean, powerful, and impatient. The trainers yelled orders, cracked whips, and told you the truth that every boy hated to hear. The sand will drink your blood first. The crowd will never forget your name. But you didn't pay attention. You were hungrier than you were afraid. Every morning started before the sun came up. You'd shovel poop, brush manes, and carry buckets until your arms shook. When the trainers weren't looking, you would sneak onto the empty track and feel like the circus was watching you in the quiet. You'd picture the stands full of thousands of Romans cheering, booing, and betting everything they had on your death or victory. It wasn't faith that kept you going, moving. It was pride. Pride in the hope that for a few minutes, everyone in Rome would see you. The Circus Maximus was the empire's beating heart. It was more powerful than any temple and louder than any Senate debate. 200,000 people watching, their voices echoing through the marble seats. During the 7 laps, men screamed, women passed out, and fortunes were made or lost. No other stage had such craziness or such beauty. You would lie awake in the stables at night, looking at the oil lamps, flickering on the walls. In the distance, the noblemen slept in villas. But in this place, where the smell of straw and sweat filled the air, heroes were born. You didn't know if you'd die under the hooves or get up above them. There was only one thing you knew. They would chant your name one day, not as a servant or a slave, but as the master of the circus, the charioteer who tamed the storm. Your world was the stables. They were hot, loud, and always one mistake away from death. You worked for the factions, the racing teams of Rome, as fierce as a legion. There were 4 colors that divided the empire more than politics or war: blue, green, red, and white. Each Roman had a side, from slaves in bars to senators in togas. The circus was more than just fun. It was faith, and you were going to be its priest. You started out as a stable boy, a shadow among giants. You brushed horses until your hands hurt, fed them barley mixed with wine, and learned to read their moods like a soldier reads an enemy. These were not normal animals. They were athletes, warriors in harness, Spanish stallions, Nubian mares, Cappadocian chargers, and other animals that were so valuable that emperors fought over them. They were both holy and cruel, But danger made people more disciplined. Rival groups were always sabotaging each other by cutting harnesses, loosening buckles, and poisoning feed. One mistake could end a career or a life. You slept lightly with one hand on your knife and the other over the reins. To keep the horses safe was to keep the future. The Dominus Faconis, the master of your team, ruled the stables with an iron whip. He told you that trusting someone was a sign of weakness and that not acting quickly enough would kill you. He'd hit you on the shoulder and say, "If the horses don't fear you, boy, the crowd won't respect you." But you couldn't rule by fear alone. You had to earn the horses' trust, and when the chariot sped up, their heartbeats would slow down with yours. That bond was the only thing that protected you. At night, the stables were full of whispered prayers. Drivers drew charms on the horses' foreheads to call on Neptune, the god of horses and the sea. Some people gave Fortuna, the goddess of luck, wine, because skill alone wasn't enough. If one axle broke, one strap came loose, or one heartbeat was too late, the crowd would trample your body into the sand before they even gasped. You stayed anyway. You put up with the heat, the sweat, and the constant danger. Because every time you went around the circus, you were promised something more exciting than freedom, immortality, and you were willing to burn in those stables until the gods saw your fire. It wasn't a race on your first day behind the reins. It was a fight against fear. The chariot looked heavy, but it was actually light. It was made of wood and leather and had wheels that were as thin as knives. If the horses made one wrong move or tripped, you would be dragged to your death before anyone could shout your name. The coaches called it learning. You said it was surviving. Drills happened every morning. You learned how to stand up straight while the chariot shook, ground that isn't level. The reins didn't wrap around your hands. They wrapped around your waist. That way, you could steer with your whole body. But if you fell, you'd be dragged until you were mush. It was the first and worst lesson. Mastery and death both used the same knots. The horses were both your partners and your killers. You remembered every snort, twitch, and shake. 4 horses, 1 brain. That was the plan. If one person made a mistake, the others did too. If one ran away, everyone else would die. You learned how to talk to them quietly, to pray with them and curse them. Their eyes were white with fire and fear, just like yours. You didn't have power over them. You became them. When you messed up, trainers yelled insults, threw whips, and threw you away. A crazy, half-deaf old soldier told you that a real Orga never blinks during a crash. He said, "You'll see splinters fly, blood spray, and skulls break. But if you blink, you'll miss your chance to live." He was right. To make it feel like the circus, they would let you race in fake races, dust, yelling, and disorder. Enemies hit the wheels of your chariot hard to try to break them. You learned to swing your whip not just at the horses, but also at other drivers, hitting their arms or faces. There were no rules in training because there were none in the arena. The lesson was how to stay alive. Your muscles hurt, your hands bled, and your heart beat like a war drum by nightfall. But the pain got better, and something colder took its place. A strange calmness. You understood that fear was pointless. The sand didn't care who lived or died. It only remembered who made a difference. You fell asleep with the horses that night. Your fingers still holding on to an imaginary rein, you dreamed of thunder, hooves, wheels, and a crowd chanting a name you knew would soon be yours. Maximus, the first time you went to the circus, you didn't breathe. You shook. The noise alone could kill a man. 200,000 Romans cheered like an ocean, and the cheers rolled off the stone seats in waves. The sound of trumpets, the sight of banners waving, and the smell of sweat, dust, and roasted meat filled the air. It, not just a race, it was a religion in action. Everyone in the empire, from the gods of Rome to every gambler, thief, senator, and slave, was watching. You took your place at the start. The castaries were 8 chariots lined up like arrows ready to be shot. The horses were wild, with their nostrils flaring and their hooves digging into the sand. You said their names like a prayer: Aquila, Nero, Pallas, and Flame, and pulled the reins tighter around your waist. The two sides glared at each other across the track. The Greens were favored today, and your team, the Blues, really needed to win. The people who placed the bets had already chosen who would live and who would die. You just had to show them they were wrong. Ad. The official let go of his cloth. A heartbeat of quiet, then a lot of noise. The gates blew open, and 8 chariots rushed forward like gods who had been set free. The wheels screamed, the sand flew, and you leaned into the turn. 2 spinning wooden circles held your whole life in balance. The first corner was a war zone. Drivers beat their opponents, and horses screamed, and the crowd screamed for blood. You felt the jolt when a competitor hit your wheel hard in an attempt to break it. You counted and told your team to stay close to the spinner. The main barrier was lined with statues of dolphins and Neptune. You were so close to them that the salt water from the fountain splashed your arm. 1 lap down, 6 more to go. The roar of the crowd turned into a beat. Every cheer felt like a drumbeat in your chest. You could tell they were watching you. Thousands of strangers whose feelings for each other changed with a single turn. For a short time, you understood why men would do anything for this craziness. You weren't afraid of death anymore. It made you happy. You didn't know if you had won or lived when you crossed the line. The sand stuck to your face like ashes, and your hands shook from the effort. But one thing was clear above the noise. The people were chanting. Maybe not loudly, at least not yet. You heard it, though, and it was just the beginning. Winning in the circus was like a drug, louder than thunder and sweeter than wine. When you won, the crowd's cheers swallowed you whole. Women threw flowers, gamblers cried with joy, and the emperor himself might have nodded in agreement. You'd go back to the stables like a victorious general, with your horses hot and proud. There was no greater victory for a slave or freedman in Rome. You could make as much money in 1 afternoon as a soldier does in 10 years, and everything else came with victory. You were famous, had a lot of money, and people wanted to be your friend. Poets wrote your name down on wax tablets that will last forever. People in the city talked about your skill, luck, and supposed charm. Even noble women, who were tired of their arranged dinners and marble husbands, sent you secret messages. You were no longer a man in Rome. You were a myth that was alive. But the knives got sharper the higher you went. The circus spoke jealousy as a second language. Enemies planned accidents. If their team lost, fans rioted, and the same people who cheered for you today would curse your name tomorrow. You learned how to smile, take care, and sleep lightly. Betrayal and glory both had smells. Your winnings let you leave your master, but not danger. Many free men raced under their own name, and many of them died in crashes or being crushed by horses. The lucky ones got statues, but most of them broke and were buried in unmarked graves outside the city walls. You bet against the gods every time you raced, and they rarely paid twice. But nothing could compare to the feeling of gold or safety, standing in front of the crowd. You raised your hand in victory and pressed the laurel crown against your hair. You'd look up at the marble stands, see the nobles who used to ignore you, and feel their envy like the sun. For a few stolen moments, you weren't a slave or a human. You were the heart of Rome. Then you would leave the track, still shaking from the speed, knowing that it could all end tomorrow. But as you brushed your horses and cleaned the dust off their manes, you said the same thing again. Every person who drove a chariot, please let me die quickly, but let me be famous. The heart of Rome didn't beat for emperors or armies. It beat for colors. Blue versus green, red versus white. These weren't just teams that raced. They were tribes, cults, and armies of passion that tore neighborhoods apart and made people lose their minds. The city's loyalty was painted in colors. A man might forgive someone who insulted his mother, but never someone who insulted his group. You wore the blue's color like armor when you drove for them. For those who believe, you were a hero. The greens saw you as an enemy. Fans wrote your name on tavern walls, sang songs about your wins, and fought over your honor. Mothers pointed you out to their sons when you walked through the markets. But you also learned to wear a cloak low when you traveled, because in the wrong part of town, admiration could turn into murder. The factions were more than just a game, they were about politics. Senators paid for teams, emperors picked favorites, and riots broke out when races got violent. There was a special kind of war diplomacy at Circus Maximus. A broken wheel could start fights in the street. A victory that is in doubt could set a district on fire. The city went crazy when the Greens said your group had bribed an official. At night, torches lit up the forum, and the Tiber ran red with the blood of the factions. The factions scared even the emperors. They weren't just fans. They were the other army of Rome. Charioteers like you could make them calm down or get angry. After a string of your wins, the emperor himself asked you to eat at his palace, not because they liked him, but because they were careful. He wanted to be sure your fame served the throne, not threatened it. You smiled, bowed, and toasted to Rome, pretending you didn't notice his guards tightening their grips. But among the rivalries, there was one face that haunted you. Your counterpart in green, a charioteer named Felix. He was fast, brutal, and fearless. The crowd called him the Serpent. Each race between you wasn't a contest, it was war. You'd meet, eyes at the starting line, each knowing only one would leave the circus alive that day. The colors, the cheers, the glory, it was all blood and illusion. Rome didn't love its heroes, it devoured them. And as long as the crowd demanded danger, the circus would feed them. One crash, one corpse, one color at a time. The circus was beautiful from the stands, but from the chariot it was a slaughterhouse. Death came quick, loud, and merciless. One snapped wheel, one frightened horse, and you were done. The Romans even had a word for it, naufragium, a shipwreck, because that's what a crash looked like. Woods splintering like waves, bodies flung into the air, and screams swallowed by the crowd's roar. You saw your first one at 16. The driver ahead of you misjudged the turn around the spiner. His wheel clipped the barrier, shattered, and sent his chariot spinning. The horses panicked, dragging him by the reins as his body bounced across the sand like a broken doll. You smelled the blood before you saw it. The crowd erupted, not in horror, but in ecstasy. Death was their favorite finish line. Every race was a gamble with fate. You learned to watch for the warning signs, the flicker in a horse's gait, the wobble of a rival's wheel, the tension in the reins. You trained yourself to react faster than thought, to steer by instinct when reason would freeze. The circus punished hesitation. A good charioteer died quick. A great one learned to make death his ally. The crashes were worse near the meta, the turning posts. Drivers fought for thee. Inside lane, where victory lived and disaster waited, you hugged the curve so tight you could feel the marble scrape your axle. Too wide and you'd lose the race. Too tight and you'd join the wreckage. There was no in between, only glory or ruin. Sometimes when a crash happened behind you, the screams faded beneath the pounding of hooves. You never looked back. To survive, you had to be ruthless. Compassion was for poets and priests, not for men who raced the gods. You told yourself each crash was another. Sacrifice to Neptune, god of horses, and whispered a prayer that it would never be your turn. But every driver knew the truth. Luck was a rope that always frayed. One day, you'd feel it snap, and when it did, the circus would keep roaring, the crowd would keep cheering, and Rome would move on. Its appetite for blood as endless as its thirst for speed. If death was always one turn away, fortune sat in the other. For the few who survived long enough, chariot racing was the quickest road from slavery to staggering wealth. Rome adored its winners with the same frenzy it used to crucify its losers. You began as property, but with every victory, you became something rarer, a man who owned his fate. Your wanings grew faster than the crowds could shout your name. Bags of silver, laurel crowns, fine cloaks and golden goblets, spoils once reserved for generals, were yours. First you bought your freedom, then you bought a house, and then you bought your own horses. When you walked in, men who used to spit at your feet now bowed. Bar. In the forum, senators nodded at you and acted like they didn't remember your slave brand. You smiled because you knew they did. Women also followed, some out of love and most out of legend. Courtesans, noble widows, and even priestesses all had reasons to pray with you. Fame made everything you touched too much. Banquets went on until dawn, and your name was shouted in drunken toasts. The gods made you fast, but not immortal, so you spent money like it was sand through your fingers. But the higher you, the air got lonelier as we climbed. Friends started to flatter each other. People who liked them turned into thieves. You found out that Rome didn't care about you. It loved the story of you. The man who beat death, controlled thunder, and made the city forget its hunger for one beautiful afternoon. But you couldn't stop. You couldn't shake the fever of fortune. The circus was your church, and each race was a prayer to keep your luck going. You put money into your own team, hired grooms, and even taught younger drivers how to drive. Some people called you Dominus Orige, the Lord of the Charioteers. It sounded good, but you knew better. Under the gold and applause, the same truth burned. Your empire was built on spinning wheels and scared horses. Poets would say your name next to Hercules and Achilles at feasts. You laughed, but the comparison made you feel cold inside. In Rome, heroes never lived long. They shone brightly for a while, then went out. And you knew that the circus would take back everything it had given you one day, whether it was because you were getting older, had an accident, or were jealous. Had given. Fortune was kind, but she always got what she was owed. Time caught up with every charioteer, no matter how fast his horses ran. When you held the reins, your hands, which used to be strong enough to tame a team of stallions, started to shake. The cheers that once made you feel good now seemed far away, as if they were being drowned out by the roar of memory. You told yourself that after one more race, you would stop racing, but the circus kept saying, just one more. The younger drivers were faster now, and they were acting like reckless boys who raced like you used to without thinking about living. They called you veteraness, partly out of respect and partly out of pity. You saw your own ghost in their eyes as they trained, hungry, fearless, and doomed. The track was the same, but you had changed. The same sand that once promised you would live forever was now ready to eat you, but every morning the itch came back. You couldn't ignore the sound of wheels rattling, the thunder of hooves, or the dangerous pull that made you want to go. So you put the reins around your waist one last time and stepped into the sun. Tied it around her waist one last time and stepped into the sun. The crowd cheered, not because it was a habit, but because they knew what was going on. You were a living legend, a relic from the good old days. The doors opened, the horses jumped forward, and for a second you felt like you were 20 again. The wind ripped at your tunic, the sand hurt your face, and your heart beat in time with the hooves. You held the meta too tightly. Pride overcomes sense. In back of you, a wheel from a competitor hit your axle. You felt the jolt and the violent shudder, the whisper of destiny. Then there was silence for a heartbeat. Things started to slow down. The sun shining on the marble statues and the sound of the crowd's breath. The second before the crash, you didn't say a prayer, you only smiled. You always knew that the circus would take you this way, When the wreck happened, the crowd didn't cry. They roared in awe. They said the horses ran 3 more laps before stopping, and the sand turned red under them. They took your broken body off the track, wrapped it in the blue colors of your faction, and put you to rest under a small monument outside the city walls. The inscription said, "He rode with the gods. He fell like a storm, and somewhere beyond the roar of the circus, you still race, forever chasing the thunder." Long before the pyramids pierced the horizon or temples echoed with hymns to Ra, the true lifeline of Egypt was already at work. The Nile. It wasn't just a river, it was an engineer of worlds, carving life out of desolation. Each year, like clockwork, it rose from. The river came from the heart of Africa, swelling with rain from faraway lands and spilling its gift across Egypt's dry valleys. When the waters came, they brought silt that was rich, dark, and miraculous. Without it, Egypt would have been nothing more than a kingdom of dust and wind. The Egyptians didn't see the flood as a natural event. They saw it as divine rhythm. They didn't just watch the river, they listened to it. The rise of the water meant rebirth, and its retreat meant the start of the harvest. Every life, the Nile was the heartbeat of the land. It set the pace for the entire calendar with 3 sacred seasons: Akhet, the flooding; Per, the growing; and Shamu, the harvest. But the river was unpredictable. Some years it rose too high, drowning fields and villages, and other years it didn't flood at all, leaving famine in its wake. So the Egyptians did what humans always do when faced with the whims of nature. They learned to shape. They used nometers carved into temple stones to measure the river's depths, recorded its moods, and built a science around how it behaved. Over the years, they turned a wild river into a precise tool. When the floodwaters started to go down, the people moved quickly, digging canals and reservoirs to trap what was left. Each family took part in this yearly ritual, turning mud and water into order. What started as a way to survive became a way to master the river. Egypt didn't just live by the Nile, it engineered it. The river's waters sparkled, and civilization saw itself in them. The river connected gods to men, priests to peasants, and life to death. Its banks became the stage where people learned that controlling nature was not about domination, but about harmony. The Nile did not belong to Egypt. Egypt belonged to the Nile, and it would keep shaping her destiny for thousands of years. When the Nile rose, Egypt held its breath. The flood was both a miracle and a threat, a blessing that could easily turn into disaster. For centuries, survival meant predicting the river's moods. And so, the Egyptians became mathematicians, astronomers, and engineers long before the words existed. They measured the world not by stars or empires, but by water. The priests of Heliopolis watched the sky, marking the annual rising of the star Sirius, Supdet, which heralded the coming flood. Its appearance in the dawn sky was no superstition. It was a signal from the heavens that the Nile was on its way. Villagers would cheer when they